Readers love watching characters face, fail, and overcome conflicts, because it is through those conflicts that the characters learn and grow. But readers don't like watching the characters face the same conflict over and over again as much. Repetition can quickly become boring. So today I want to talk about person versus what now, types of conflict in creative writing. There are 4 broad categories of conflict in writing: person versus self, person versus person or group, person versus nature, and person versus god or goddess. Today we're going to do an overview of these different types of conflict. I'm going to follow this video up with some other videos that are going to dive into each of these individual categories. And if you hang on until the end of this video, I'll tell you how you can get a free revision checklist, because often we add in some conflict in revision. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers, because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. Let's start with, what is person versus self conflict? Person versus self is when your character is in their own way. There is a force inside of themselves that is working against them. This makes person versus self almost entirely internal conflict. Here are some examples: lack of self-esteem or confidence, insecurities or self-doubt, addiction, coming of age or finding one's identity, illness or disability, mental and physical. I'll talk about that asterisk in a second. Indecision, and lack of self-control. Person versus self conflicts often drive character growth, so it's essential to that arc in your story. This is why literary and character-driven stories feature person versus self conflicts. Think of the book and movie The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. In this story, the main character is struggling with depression, suicidal thoughts, a traumatic past, all sorts of internal conflicts. That's what's driving this story. Or you can think of the addiction and self-destructive tendencies of Jenny in Forrest Gump by Winston Groom. Yes, that movie is actually based on a book. The conflicts these two characters face are mostly the person versus self internal conflicts. Next, I want to talk about what is person versus person or group conflict. When your character is facing an opposing force that is another character, you have person versus person conflict. Because that other character is outside of yours, it is an external conflict. Now, there are 2 different schools of thought when it comes to this. Some people break this category into 2. They have person versus person and person versus society. How I was taught and how I view this is these are the same thing. It's still a person versus a person. There's just more than one person that they are up against at a time. So it's person versus group, group versus group, or person versus person. It's all the same type of conflict. But some people do like to separate it into individual versus individual and groups. Think of it however it works best for you. There's not really a wrong way. Now, let's look at some examples. Physical fights, verbal arguments, misunderstandings. War, competition or games, rebellions and revolutions, criminals and authority figures. When people think of person versus person conflict, usually they immediately think of some big explosive fight or argument. That's fine. That is person versus person, but it doesn't have to be that dramatic. If you have 2 characters up for the same job promotion, that's still person versus person conflict. The conflict doesn't have to be mean-spirited or violent. Think of The Princess Bride by William Goldman. In that story, Wesley faces a lot of different conflicts, and most of them are not actually mean-spirited. When he is up against Inigo Montoya, they're having more of a friendly sword fight than a cutthroat battle. When he faces the giant Fezzik, again, it's more of a friendly competition. They're both being polite and cordial towards one another. It's not mean-spirited at all. Now, it can be more intense than that, of course. If you look at something like Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, there are a lot of different, very intense person versus person conflicts. Most of these are Harry and or his friends versus some segment of the Death Eaters. So it could be Harry one-on-one with a Death Eater, Harry and his friends versus a single Death Eater, or Harry and his friends versus a group of Death Eaters of some sort. So we have all of these different types of person versus person in that one franchise. So that's an overview of person versus person conflicts. Next, I want to talk about what is person versus nature conflict. If the natural world is interfering with your story, you probably have person versus nature conflict. This is when the setting itself is the opposing force working against your character. Usually, person versus nature is an external type of conflict. Here are some examples. Natural disasters, weather, survival, animals and beasts, mountains, hills, trails, and other features, fire, oceans and other large bodies of water, zombies, and illness or disabilities. There's that asterisk again. So let's talk about that asterisk first. Why I put an asterisk next to illness is because whether this is a person versus self or person versus nature conflict depends on your philosophies and your approach to that conflict in your story. So if you are viewing the body as a part of the self, it is person versus self. It's them versus themselves. If you view the body as a part of nature and the self as something separate from that, then an illness or disability is person versus nature. So it depends on your philosophy and how you approach it in your story. Jan Martel's The Life of Pi is a great example of person versus nature because we get to see different types of this conflict. You have the main character who is shipwrecked. So that's person versus nature right there in a storm. Then he survives 227 days at sea. That survival is him versus nature. At the same time, he has to deal with a full-grown tiger also on the boat with him. So that's another type of person versus nature. Person versus nature is a great way to use your setting in your story. So if you're trying to make your setting more than just a backdrop, like you should be, then adding person versus nature conflict will help you do that. Next, let's discuss what is person versus supreme being conflict. In person versus supreme being, the opposing force your character faces is a god or goddess or the universe or some other all-knowing, all-powerful entity. Like person versus person, some people divide person versus supreme being into two categories. Basically, they separate the internal conflict types and the external conflict types. So they will have person versus destiny and person versus the supernatural. Again, I think of these all as one type of conflict, but you can think of it however works best for you. Here are some examples of person versus supreme being. Most mythological stories: prophecies, fates, and destinies, faith and belief struggles, demons, devils, and other forces of evil working against your characters, the afterlife, choosing between good and evil, ghosts, spirits, and other things like that. Sometimes people will add religious conflicts to this category, but usually that's actually more of person versus person. The conflict is between an individual and the religious group, not actually the individual and the god of that religious group. Some types of person versus supreme being are internal conflicts. In Heaven is for Real by Todd Burpo, the main character is struggling to come to terms with the fact that his young son has had an interaction with God, and he's wondering why God essentially chose his son and not him, and doesn't choose to interact with more people the way that God chose to interact with his son. So this is more of an internal faith and belief struggle. Yes, it's a little bit him versus his God, but not really. It's more him coming to terms with what he feels about this thing that has happened. So it's still person versus supreme being, but it's inside of him. Now we can have person versus supreme being that's an external conflict where your character's literally up against a physical manifestation of that supreme being. We see this in books like The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. There are lots of examples of the characters facing and dealing with literal gods, goddesses, forces of evil that are significantly more powerful than them. And of course, most Greek mythology is all person versus supreme being of the external conflict variety. In my experience, this tends to be the least common of these four main types of conflict. I see the person versus self and the person versus person in most stories. Person versus nature is the next most common, and then the person versus supreme being. That doesn't mean it's not used, it's just not used as frequently. Next, I want to talk about the bonus, person versus technology or magic. Person versus technology is quickly becoming the fifth main type of conflict. Now, it's not quite yet, because a lot of person versus technology can actually be filtered into these other conflicts. Person versus the Terminator. I would argue the Terminator is a character in his own right. It's almost a sentient robot. At that point, it's technically person versus person. The Matrix is almost a god, so that could be considered person versus supreme being. And if you have a machine doing what it was designed to do, and it accidentally crushes a person, that's kind of like person versus nature. That one's a little bit more iffy, but you could still filter it there. So person versus technology can be separated into the other categories. Or we can all agree that it's time to make it its own. Here are some examples of true person versus technology conflicts. Structural failure, pipes breaking, generators failing, that sort of thing. Surveillance and recordings, weapons of all kinds acting on their own. Inventions gone awry. When it comes to person versus technology, it is only truly person versus technology if it is the technology acting against the person on its own. It's not the technology being used by someone else. So if someone else is using that technology, it's actually person versus person, because it's the other person that is the opposing force, not the technology in and of itself. If we have someone using a weapon of some sort, the weapon is technology, but it's not what's in conflict with the other person. The person wielding the weapon is what's in conflict with your character. Most people would automatically think of science fiction as person versus technology, but not all science fiction is technically person versus technology. It has a lot of technology in it, but the technology itself is not the opposing force. A similar argument can be made for magic in fantasy. Magic could perhaps be put in its own category, but like technology, it can pretty easily be filtered into those other four types of conflict categories. For example, in a lot of fantasy, magic is a part of the natural world. It's an energy or element that exists within the world. Therefore, it's nature. So if your character is up against magic doing what it naturally does, that's person versus nature. Then if your character has a type of magic within themselves and they're trying to control it, well, again, that's could be person versus nature, or more likely, person versus self. It's not actually person versus magic. It's not actually the magic that's the opposing force. I'd argue that person versus technology is closer to its own category than person versus magic. Either way, both of these can add great variety of conflict to your story. I want to leave you with an editor and author's thoughts on the types of conflict. The reason I recommend authors learn and occasionally review these different types of conflict is to keep fresh ideas flowing. You don't have to articulate what each conflict in your story is. It doesn't matter that much. But if you remind yourself of the different types of conflict, you will naturally include more variety, which will create a more complex and interesting story for your readers. In a previous video, I talked about why you need internal and external conflict in creative writing. I said that most great stories have both of those types of conflict. That's because variety adds to the plot arc and the character arc. So internal drives character, external drives plot. These 4 types of conflict fit within internal and external conflict. So again, variety is just going to make for a more textured, interesting story. It's going to ensure that your characters are arcing, growing, changing, and your plot is arcing, driving forward, having an impact on your characters. In addition, having a variety of conflicts your characters face will make your story less predictable. There's this weird phenomenon in readers where they like something to be familiar but different. So if you can surprise them with the type of conflict your characters face, you might be following a trope or pattern in your chosen genre, but you are making it unique with the type of conflict. That's one way variety and conflict can help your story. So, which type of conflict is your go-to? Which one do you tend to write more than the others? I have more person versus person, probably, than anything else in my writing. Share yours in the comments below. And for more videos on conflict and other aspects of writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping authors like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and author. To find out more about me, go to www.ignitedinkwriting.com. That is where you will find your revision checklist, and I have linked to it in the comments below. Remember, we don't always have all of these conflicts added in our first draft. Sometimes we insert them in revision. That's what this checklist will help you do. And if you want to see how I use a variety of conflicts in my writing, go to caitlinburvey.com. That's where you will find my book, When Magic Calls, and other writings. And now it's your turn to make sure you're including a variety of conflicts: person versus self, person versus person, person versus nature, person versus supreme being, even person versus technology, to make sure your characters are growing and your plot is being driven forward, and to ignite your ink.